This panel is entitled Design Failures and Technological Development. It is the second panel that we have also organized in cooperation with the Center for Judicial Cooperation of the UI, and the purpose is that in this particular panel we are going to bring together also judges and introduce them into a discussion which does not very often have the judicial perspective and the technical perspective present at the same time. Just briefly to introduce to you the distinguished speakers of the panel, we first hear Amadeo, who is a judge at the Court of Milan currently. Then we have Carolina, who is also a judge in Spain. We continue with Garfield, who will provide us with a technical perspective. And we continue with Filippo from the EASA. And the last speaker, and certainly not least, is Michael from Frequentis. I think what we will see in this panel is a nice contrast between the legal and the technical understanding of what actually design failures are. From what I understand, there will be also the institutional question of who is responsible for defining design failures or failures in general, and who is responsible for dealing with them in an institutional, let's say, point of view. I think we will also address the systems approach. So how do we deal with the fact that there are multiple actors in a chain of liabilities, and how can legal systems come to terms with this? At the same time, we will apply these kind of abstract notions with very, very concrete examples of technologies which bring into question, to some extent, the very rigid categories that are often present in the legal system. So with this introduction, I would like to pass the word on to Amadeo, and I look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the, the presentation and for inviting me to this extremely interesting meeting. As a judge, perhaps I am supposed to present some case law about the issue. But as you already know, there is no really specific case law on the issue of this panel, design failure and technological development. We have in Italy some cases very important. One is the case of the disaster in the Linate airport in Milan, where there was a crash between two airplanes, and another case happened in Turin. It was a case of a plane of Aeroflot that crashed when landing. But in this, in the case of Torino, the only responsibility was not from in legal terms, but in technological terms, the responsibility was of the pilots, because they received, as far as we can read in the opinion, they received from the, control on ground all the correct and necessary information, okay? But they did not know what they had to know, what was the general situation of the airport in Torino. So from a technical point of view, it was strict responsibility of these people. Even though in civil terms, the responsibility was of the society of Aeroflot that was carrying the plane. The case of Linate is a little bit more connected with some technological aspects, because also in that case there was a responsibility of the human factor, but there was a lack of some supplementary radar that perhaps could give the possibility to avoid the accident. The only case I have found that is very close to the issue of this panel is a case of a boat. You know that the background is quite common, flying and sailing. And so the case of a boat who had an accident because of a malfunctioning of the automatic pilot. And so the owner of the boat, this is a case of the Corte d'Appello di Firenze, 2004, the owner of the boat sued the producer and seller of the automatic pilot, saying it is because of the malfunctioning of this device that I had the accident. But the experts appointed in the trial, they said no, the automatic pilot, it was right, functioned well. The only problem was the pump, the hydraulic pump for governing the rudder. So the seller and producer was acquitted, and the owner did not receive any compensation because the responsibility was of another person, another entity that was not in that trial. So, but even though we do not have specific case law, we have some legal concepts that we can use reasoning about design failures. So in general terms, when we introduce some automation in something that we were used to do without automation, the first legal effect is that the chain of legal responsibilities becomes longer. And becomes longer and more actors can take place in this chain of responsibility, and we have more interaction. If we consider the case of automation in an aircraft, the producer of the aircraft as a whole is the seller, if seen from the point of view of the air company that buys the plane, but it is the consumer if seen from the point of view of the specific technological device that is inserted in the aircraft. So even the same rule of the responsibility of the producer, that is a basic issue in European legislation, can change shape according to the specific situation and what we are talking about. Well, another point that can be used as a criterion is when we say automatic system, what we are talking about. Automatic system is something that inserted in the aircraft is still under the control of the producer that continues selling upgrades, assistance, and so on, or it is under the power, let's say, of the owner, user. Because this can make a lot of difference. Because if the producer, because the producer is supposed to have the complete know-how about the device, if the producer has the full control on how the device is used, if the producer is the only one that is able to give assistance and upgrading the software and so on, we have to say that if there is some failure for design or functioning or whatever, the responsibility should be of the producer. But if this automatic system gives to the owner user, is the same, some possibility to change it. not to change, of course, the design, not to change the software in se. But if we consider the adaptive robots, or robots with an adaptive software, these robots are able to change, to make experience and to change according to the experience that they do. So I do not know, because I am not absolutely an expert in this field, but this is a crucial point for responsibility, because in my view, and not only in my view, if the user has the possibility to grow up, let's say, as a child, to grow up the system, using it and making experience and exploiting some possibilities of the system rather than others, and so on. If something wrong happens, we have to see very carefully why this happened. If this is a failure of the design, or this is a failure of the way the system is used, or the way the system is educated, let's say. And also, the role of humans change, because the role of humans is different, of course, because there is a change in the job, because the pilot, for instance, moves from a man or woman that has the responsibility to act to a man or woman that has the responsibility to control something and to intervene at a second level. This can be also a completely different job. And so the need of a specific training for pilots who has the responsibility of training. Because basically, we have to say that the responsibility is the responsibility of the air company, okay? But if the producer of the technological system has the full control of the technicalities of the system, of course the training has to be given by the producer. And so if something wrong happens because of a lack of training, we can have a different distribution of responsibility depending on what the training has to be about. I finished my presentation in time, I suppose, and I apologize for the poor things I have presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are moving on to the next judicial perspective with Caroline.
Thank you, Hannah. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Giuseppe Contiscia and the Center for Judicial Cooperation for giving me the opportunity to be here today and to take part in this conference. And as a frequent flyer, I would also like to say how pleased and grateful I am to see that there are so many people concerned and working from so many different perspectives for the safety of air navigation. Thank you all. Now going to my presentation. I would like to give a judicial perspective or point of view on all this subject of liability, and I would like to do it from a general overview point of view. We are facing now this situation of increased automation. Is helpful, it certainly is, we need it, but we are becoming dependent. We need it to manage complex activities successfully. In Europe, we have 30,000 flights daily that have to be managed, and it is estimated, and I got this from SESAR website, that by 2030, air traffic will double in Europe. So we certainly need technological development to address these challenges and to do it efficiently, safely, and in a sustainable way. Society demands safety and accountability, and we have to remember that growth must be green. We have to remember this at the same time. We need to be prepared for failures and the allocation of liabilities. And this should be done, in my view, establishing a group of experts and advance clear and specific international legislation. This is something I think we need. We also have to be prepared for the rapid allocation of liabilities and redress and compensation in case of failure resulting damages. I think society demands this rapid allocation of liabilities and these quick redress and compensation mechanisms, and I think citizens have a right to expect this. And in my view as well, for this, to do this, we need to attribute responsibility to the companies or private parties designing and developing the automated operative systems, and to the companies or private actors using those systems for profit. In my view as well, pilots and controllers should only be prosecuted or subject to judicial proceedings in case of intentional damage, of willful damage, or extreme, and I really mean extreme, recklessness. Because the pilots and controllers have a very exacting, very demanding job. And we don't want to give them added worries. We want them to work with a peace of mind of knowing that they will only be subject to judicial proceedings if there is a clear case of either intentional damage or extreme recklessness. And I think that European authorities should establish in advance supranational common legislation that allocates strict liability to the actors involved in the activity and compulsory insurance for all private actors. And in my opinion, regulation should impose to the automation designing companies the obligation to dedicate financial resources to research and development for improving the safety and reliability of the automated systems designed, developed and commercialized. And if this were carried out, I think it would be effective in reducing insurance costs and thus keeping the companies and all private actors profitable without increasing consumers' final transport cost. I also think it might be useful if the legislation established a set table for compensation for loss of lives and personal injuries, and that if it also established who is entitled to that compensation in case of death. What relatives are entitled to that compensation. We have this table and this system of preset compensation for death and personal injuries in Spain in the cases of car accidents, and it has been very useful because everybody can know in advance what compensation they are going to get, depending on the personal injury suffered, or in cases of death of a very close relative. And everybody also knows who is going to get that compensation in the case of death. And that is also good, I think, for insurance companies. And in fact, the system was established in Spain for car accidents, following the request of insurance companies who came up with ideas on how the system should be established and how the table should be construed, should be made. I think that regulation should also compel all private actors profiting from the automated activity to research ways to reduce the environmental impact of the activity. I think this is very important if we consider the number of flights that we have daily over flying in this space, in this European airspace. And I think that European authorities should also establish a public board of experts that, should a failure happen, awarded compensation and redress for the resulting damages, regardless of the European country where the failure and damages occur and the nationality of the claimants. This may be controversial, but I think we need to take these settlements away from the courts, because we take too long in settling these disputes. There's Überlingen accident that happened in 2002. In Spain, we gave a ruling 10 years later, and I think this is really unfair for the victims and for the victims' family. We cannot take too long, and the judicial system takes too long, and we must face it, and we must find alternative ways of getting to a settlement, and I think this would be a good way, because ultimately, the courts and judges rely on the experts' opinion. We end up following what the experts say, so why shouldn't they do it straight away? I think it will be much quicker and much more effective. And this public body or board, in my view, should be formed with legal and technical experts who allocated liabilities and set compensation outside national courts. And for this, we need strict liability, because that's the only way we can do it outside the courts. We need legislation, common legislation, supranational legislation that allocates strict liability on private actors. And in this way, all disputes and claims arising from damages from the same failure could be settled in a faster way, and avoiding jurisdiction issues and the problems of overloaded courts and multiple lengthy judicial proceedings and different national legislations. We need to make use of technological advances to better manage complex and risk-loaded activities. That would be my first conclusion. We need to be prepared in advance to face failures, especially those resulting in damages, and multiple damages especially. For this, we need international regulation, both on the obligations of private actors, compulsory investment on investigation, for the prevention of safety and environmental risk, mandatory insurance, and on the allocation of civil responsibilities and liabilities in case of failure and damages, excluded, as I said before, pilots and controllers. Should a failure resulting in harm and damages to persons or property happen, there should be a preset public body of experts that settled outside national courts all claims resulting from the same failure, and if possible, with this preset table of compensation for some personal injuries. And every private actor that profits from the activity in which a failure occurs should be held civilly responsible with strict liability, although in different degrees or with joint or proportional liability as set by the legislation or established in each case by the public board of experts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this almost revolutionary perspective. I think it was a very interesting presentation. And we are going to continue with the technical perspective provided by Garfield.
I'm going to give a few examples of where design has caused failure based on the example of ACAS-X and how that has been redressed. So there have been many cases where we know that the system, which has been developed for many, many years, but was initially put into service around about early 1990s. The initial system that was put in place, version 602 for the initiated, was actually almost dangerous in level-off situations. This was very, very quickly detected and corrected. After a while, it became noticeable that there were still issues in the revised version, 604A, as it was known, that was put in place. To use the words of the world's favorite airline, it was marginally operationally acceptable. Also, the version had one particular piece of advice, which was it could give to pilots. It was something like, don't climb or don't descend. unfortunately, sometimes pilots didn't hear the word don't. This was unfortunate. Also, multi-aircraft logic was when you had more than 2 aircraft. It was found in practice this was not as good as it might be. So there was a need to have a new version, and a new version was produced, version 7, the one that was involved in the Überlingen accident. And even as version 7 was getting it, the MOPs, the standards, were being finalized, it was recognized that there was a problem. There was the problem that actually led to the Überlingen disaster. But there was a trade-off to be made. The trade-off was between getting out a system that was demonstrably better, safer, and you could get that out really very quickly now, or you could spend an extra year studying the one issue that was left, and as Murphy's Law turned out, was the one that caused the Überlingen accident. The decision was made, we will go with putting this safer system in quicker. We thought that was a better benefit. Happened to turn out wrong. Also, whilst we were opening up the box as a result of Überlingen and other accidents that were involving this, we noticed that the fix for our problem, don't climb, was to use the words adjust vertical speed adjust. Unfortunately, adjust vertical speed adjust doesn't mean anything to anybody. You have to actually look down at the display to understand what's going on. And some people had just been making a maneuver, some pilots, and they heard adjust vertical speed adjust, so we must adjust even more of what we're doing, and it was the wrong way. They weren't looking at the display. So again, our fix to one problem didn't solve it. The problem still remained. One thing that I will say is about Überlingen and the judgment that was made there. And with respect, I'm sure that the judges did a very good job, but I seeing it as an engineer, I have a very different feeling for some of the things that were said. The most shocking to me was that part of the judgment was based on 2-second imprecise recordings that is saying that in the judgment it says the implementation was non-compliant. And why was it non-compliant? Well, because we had these 2-second imprecise recordings on board of the aircraft which were not required as part of the standard in any shape or form, and these somehow prove that the system was non-compliant. So, in other words, somebody had put in an extra option not required by the standards, and they were now being penalized to hell for it, saying that you didn't do a proper job. Now, the legal reason why they got slapped for this is because one side made the argument that these recordings showed that the equipment was not correct, and the other side didn't bother to even make a reply. But to an engineer, this is so flagrant. These are the sort of things that you don't even need to respond to. It's just idiotic what was being suggested. But in the eyes of the law, this was something that somebody had made an argument, nobody rebutted it. Therefore, it must be true. There are other more subtle issues on the state-of-the-art design that, as I said, I've described this problem that was related to the ultimate accident in Überlingen. We knew that there was a problem, but it was decided better get out the system earlier rather than later. And from the manufacturer's point of view, they thought that they were doing everything according to the state of the art. It's a big process to get it through all the standardization bodies to make any changes. What I have subsequently heard earlier this morning is that maybe if you've got a good argument, you can get something through temporarily on a lesser developed, lesser validated basis if you've got good cause to do it. But that was not understood. I also agree with the first speaker that training is an issue. It was an issue in Überlingen. It will remain an issue for pilots, and I believe that needs to take place. That improvements need to take place. But then those were the actual design faults. But then what happened as a result of them? I'm going to talk about the rail industry for just a minute. There was a very famous inquiry in the UK called the Clapham, there was the Clapham Junction rail accident. And there was a public inquiry because quite a few people were killed as a result of this. And what was significant was that the inquiry insisted on going beyond immediate cause. So it was clear that the person who installed a particular switch had done so in a very shoddy way. But they didn't blame him, they blamed the supervisor who claimed that he'd checked this and in fact had not done so, he'd just gone off early from work. And then they went beyond that to saying, well, what was the management role in this? And why weren't managers supervising these things? And they went back and back and back all the way up to the highest levels of management in British Rail, really attacking the whole procedure and safety setup that was there. Now, I'm not advocating going as far as necessarily that, but it's clear that you have to go beyond the immediate cause. And that indeed is what the ACAS work has done. So when problems were found, in each case, we updated the validation models, fast time simulations that we were using. Safety standards have been gradually improving over time. Software standards have been put in place. Arguably, they're a little too rigorous, but they are getting put in place. And we are getting things better. There's specific sets of failure analysis tools that are present, failure modes and effect analysis. There's also, this is prior to implementation, and then there are post-implementation analyses. There's the accident investigations, of course, but as was said earlier, we shouldn't just rely on those, we should also have monitoring of failures before they become catastrophic. Yep, there will be many common requirements that you do that will stay in place, stay stable, multiple implementations, multiple teams, trials, all sorts of other good practices, and we need to make sure that those are there too. In conclusion, what are the points I want to make is that design failures should lead to re-evaluation of not only the design, but the design and the development process that goes with it.
Thank you. Presently, I still work with EASA until the 31st of January, but I already started to work with University Partenope in Naples, and so I took the liberty of using this second logo on my slides. And in a while, I may have another logo, but it's a long story. So thanks, Anna, for giving me the floor. And congratulations to Paola, Giuseppe, and her crew. because I have 45 years of experience in aviation, and I always found enormous difficulties in putting around the same table jurists, magistrates, and aviators. And so you succeeded in something which in 45 years of career I have never achieved myself. So congratulations. So the title of the round table is Design Failures. So I am a poor engineer. I know nothing about civil or criminal procedures. I don't even dare to dig into what is liability. And so I prefer to stay on the technical side. But there were, in few slides that you have seen a few minutes ago, delivered by Carolina, two interesting words, if I understood you. Society demands safety and accountability, you said. And this is what we try to do in EASA, not only to maintain high safety, but also to clearly identify responsibilities. Which legal or individual person is responsible for what? This is not yet apportionment of channeling of liability, but is the basis for the juries then to discuss liability. But then who are these persons and how do we apportion technical responsibility? In the past, we basically considered the aircraft as the only thing on which we had real requirements. And there is a famous rule, which we call 1309, where the applicant, which is the designer of the aircraft, Boeing, Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, Augusta Westland, Selex Systems, and whoever you want, has to demonstrate that the possible failure or failure condition in the system, so even mismatch between two interface systems with software, will not lead to a catastrophe or another dangerous event with a probability greater than something. The defect of this rule is that it considers the system self-contained into the shell of the aircraft. The other domains, operations, aerodromes, air navigation services, basically are not considered. I don't mention the humans. I know that they are important. We have the shell model and all these things, but here I want to speak about systems. But for systems, the reality is evolving because the aircraft safety depends on communication and navigation signals which come from outside. These signals from outside can come from different entities. In Italy today, there are at least 3 major providers of navigation signals. You know them? Well, GPS, we have in our cars everywhere. So the Pentagon is one of the providers of navigation signals. But even European system EGNOS, we have EGNOS signals hovering over Italy, and ENAV, which has a number of beacons. But each of them may be over-redundant because none of them takes into account the redundancy in the other. And once we buy an airline ticket, we pay all these unnecessary redundancies. But the modern navigation system only tell you the position. They don't tell you where you have to go. So you need the database on board, provided by Jepsen, Lido, or similar companies, and the safety of flight depends also on the accuracy of this data. And we also know, by the history of aviation, that 90% of accidents and serious incidents are not due to technical failures of the aircraft, but to other operational causes, not for airworthiness. And there we have the problem. I have my ideas, but sometimes before expressing my ideas, I go back to see what my master said. And my master, in the first place, is the EU legislation. In recital 1 of Regulation 1108 of 2009, which was the extension of EASA competence to aerodromes and ATM, the legislator, so not me, said that the EASA has to take a total system approach. Total system approach means that we have to look at all the components which contribute to a safe flight, not only the aircraft producer, not only the airline operating the aircraft, not only air traffic management, not only the training school for the pilots, everything together. So no single manufacturer delivers the total system. If there is no single applicant which says, I guarantee this, this means that the responsibility to apportion the reliability requirements can only belong to the regulators. And when I say this to my regulator colleagues, they start shivering, because the majority of them are honest bureaucrats which only put the crosses in the questionnaire and say, yes, compliant, 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 but say, now you have to take decisions yourself, not just to verify compliance. Most of them are horrified. So where do we go? I want to give you a practical example. Detect and avoid for drones. You know that drones do not have pilot on board, and so society fears that may collide with other aircraft, possibly even more frequently than manned aviation. But before colliding, there is a key event, which is a reduced separation between the drone and the other aircraft. But once you have lost separation, maybe that is because of a failure inside the system of the drone, the aircraft or the ground station or the data link, whatever, but something which belongs to the designer of the drone. The end event is in the worst case, is a mid-air collision. But between the loss of separation and mid-air collision, there are a lot of other barriers. The TCAS on board of large aeroplanes, air traffic control, route design, the aircraft density in a given airspace, the eyes of the other pilot in the case of general aviation. All these external factors cannot be under the responsibility of the designer of the drone. And if we say we want a probability of mid-air collision once in 1 billion flight hour, which is normally what we use for the catastrophes, this will make the drone unmanageable, triple redundancies, a software, no customers on the market. So the only entity which can say, we apportion part of this budget to air traffic control, part to the other aircraft, and so the design objectives for the drone as a discount, not 10 to the minus 9, only once in a billion hour, but let's say once in a million hour, 1,000 times more relaxed, then the ARPA's designer can have an easier life and have better penetration on the market. But this is a terrible responsibility, and I believe that it's unavoidable that we go in this way, and definitely the legislator, once gave EASA the responsibility for the total system, said you have to look at all the parts and assign objectives to each of them. No more, otherwise it becomes too technical.
All right. So thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity for allowing me to present here in this round a bit the probably also manufacturing perspective. So my name is Michael Holzbauer. I'm coming from an ATM system manufacturer. So Frequentis, for those of you who don't know, Frequentis is a communication and information solution provider in or for safety critical environments. So we are not only developing solutions in the ATM environment, but also in other domains like for public transport or public safety. So wherever safety critical control center solutions are needed, then we are building solutions and integrating those solutions. In the previous presentations, I've found already lots of points where for us as being a manufacturer, probably some thoughts were running through my brain on what does that mean really for, I think you, Carolina, said it, an organization who is looking to the profit. And in fact, my approach here in this presentation is coming a bit from the business perspective, so it's probably fitting a bit to that point here. In one of the yesterday's presentation, I think it was from Michael Stander right in the morning, he mentioned a couple of driving concepts for the future of ATM in Europe, and I picked here 3 of the driving concepts which are kind of demonstrating that it's really a very complex future we are looking forward to. So starting with system-wide information management, I think SWIM has already been discussed quite thoroughly in the frame of the Alias project. Just to recap, SWIM, from technical perspective, provides several building blocks starting on the technical infrastructure, so where we see some central services. Then we have the information infrastructure, the information exchange models, and we have somewhere the applications. And the reason why I picked this model here is that for each of those building blocks, we typically have different responsibilities and even different accountabilities, different operators, different service providers. The second concept I picked here is 4D trajectory. So 4D trajectory is coming more from the concept of operation. So we will see in future flights which are already in advance, both timely but also geographically, point for point, completely planned, which needs the highest level of automation. So there are discussions ongoing whether we will ever reach this highest level of automation, and that also probably is, or probably one of the reasons why it takes a long time before we come there is the question of liability. And the one about which I want to talk a bit longer is the topic about virtualization and centralization. Virtualization and centralization, so the first concepts of virtualization are already deployed in the frame of SESAR. So we see the remote tower deployment, so where we have an airfield controlled, the air traffic management for a specific airfield is done from a completely different place. Visualization is done just via camera technology, via broadband connectivity, and also in this virtualization we see already several actors, multiple actors involved here. And when talking about centralization, I just want to remind on the Eurocontrol initiative on the centralized services, which is for sure a quite innovative concept, allowing to build on synergies, reaching the single European sky targets in a possible and good way. But this centralization or centralized services as such brings me also to the question on the accountability of the stakeholders. So for centralized services, we typically have somewhere I would say in the middle, the single European sky targets. So we have the targets. We want to gain out of synergies. We want to reduce our ATM costs. We want to increase safety. So that means we have to think on how can we reach that. So we need some kind of innovation. And typically, I think Gerald mentioned it today in the morning, it's the fun of the technicians to be innovative. However, innovation by itself makes fun, of course, but the manufacturers are typically only doing that what their customers are telling them to do. So we as manufacturer are a project company, so whatever a customer tells us to do, we are doing that. And I think the example Garfield mentioned before, that the company who is building in something in addition, probably with a goodwill to evaluate, to record, to find out in case something happens, is then the one who is guilty at the end. So we are, as manufacturer, very much bound on the regulations, on standards, on that what the customers are telling us. So one of the questions in the preparation Hannah asked was, is liability hindering innovation? So, and if we take it really like that, then probably yes, because then if we were not in a position to introduce new ways of possibility of managing, of centralization in that specific example, then we would still be there where we have been some 10, 20, 30 years ago. So innovation allows also for new concept of operations. So with the new possibilities on centralized services, so with high-performance networks, with SWIM on the backbone, with information models, data models, we can reach new concept of operations, supported by a high level of automation, of course. And altogether, that brings us also the possibility, which is of course for us as manufacturer interesting, the possibility of new business models. So now back to the centralized services. The discussion initiated by Eurocontrol goes into the direction that there should be governed, or there should be services by Eurocontrol, governed by Eurocontrol, but the service provider should be a team of ANSPs together with developers, together with manufacturers, probably together with other subcontractors. And in such a complex scenario, I'm really questioning on whether someone, I don't know, yeah, on whether someone had thought on the legal, on the liability implication if something happens, and even if nothing happens. But the question here is, if we are now in a situation where we see in Europe the typically the manufacturing industry producing the technical solutions, teaming up with the navigation service providers, offering a service where today for the manufacturer it's typically, and I think Filippo mentioned it also before, we are talking here about the system of systems. It's the system approach, and it's only the navigation service provider today who has the complete system in his hand, who can be the one who can be certified. So if we now breaking up those teams or creating new teams, then for me it's a real question on what does that mean for future liability, and complexity is for sure with that quite increased.
Okay. Thank you for the speeches. We've heard quite diverse, but I think all related number of perspectives. So we started out with a longer, let's say, chain of responsibility, and we see that the legal system has problems to apply categories to a system which becomes increasingly complex, but merits also to be treated as a system. We've had very interesting proposals, I think, in terms of compensation, because if we think about liability, of course, there are different functions that liability can fulfill. And therefore, liability can serve as a mechanism to enhance safety, because it's an incentive for manufacturers to produce safe devices. but also there is a compensation and compensatory function in liability and damages that are awarded. So it is sometimes worth to think about those different functions. And for example, one of the proposals put forward, such as a victims fund, I think is interesting from this perspective, that it takes apart one of the functions of liability and places it in a separate institution. At the same time, what the other presentations brought out is an institutional question in terms of regulation. How much regulation do we need? Who is going to draw up the regulation? And which are the entities actually capable of dealing with technical failures? Is it the judiciary? Is it the regulator ex ante? Or is it a board of experts? Therefore, I would invite the audience to, if you have specific questions, address the relative speaker, and to also, if you want to comment, feel free to comment, please. I see Gerald quite keen to intervene.
Yes, of course. Muchísimas gracias por su ponencia. But I would like to comment, let's say, or a little bit skeptical comments. I fully agree with you that we need some sort of a one-stop shop principle, yeah, in order to assign, let's say, all these kind of liabilities. But as we heard before in the panel, what is really intriguing industry is criminal law. And you won't solve that with a one-stop principle. You can do this by some sort of mandatory arbitration or something like that in civil law, but never you can do that in criminal law perspective. And concerning also the panel before, I really would cast a big doubt on whether member states would be willing to have a harmonization of criminal law in the member states. Think about that. They always had been absolutely reluctant, not willing to pass on any competence to the European Commission concerning criminal law. So, first point. Second point, if we're talking about mandatory insurance, I think the relevant question before that should be, why do we have to have a mandatory insurance? Why? Why are there market failures? Because normally in our model, if liability really works out, the provisions, then, according to theory, all these external effects should be internalized by the liability provisions. So the market itself, the corporations, etc., would require such an insurance. But this is not the case. And so we should ask, why is it not functioning, the market itself? Why do we need some sort of such a regulation for that? Maybe it's due to liability provisions on the material level, or maybe it's more, as Vincenzo already pointed out, more on the enforcement level, and then we should talk about the enforcement. And this is just a side remark concerning the whole project. I think you should look more closely into what happened in the past concerning, for example, environmental protection. Environmental liability, as well as other innovative technologies. All the stories what we heard today, also concerning organizational failure, also concerning management failure, etc. All this had been discussed 2 decades ago concerning environmental, concerning nuclear plants, etc., etc. And finally, what is also very interesting, the victim funds. This is already reality, but imposed by whom? By the prosecutors. And this is what is happening, at least in Germany, this is happening. They are threatening the enterprises, the management, with starting a criminal procedure. And then there will be a settlement with the prosecutor. And by that, for example, in a very interesting environmental case, a huge victim fund had been established by the industry, even by industrial associations, in order to compensate by the victim funds. But it was never realized by authorities' regulation, never realized by liability class actions or anything like that. It was by criminal law. And for that reason, I would really strongly suggest also for the consortium to have a closer look at how criminal law in these areas is functioning in the different member states. Should be very interesting to see.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that if we are talking of a single European sky, we should have a single legal space. And it makes no sense, from my point of view, that we are seeing how technology is developing into more practical ways of helping humanity to handle complex activities, and that law keeps so backwards and unpractical, and that the legal response is so lengthy and complicated, and it ends up being an added problem to the victims. So and that's why I think that we should have common legislation, because we need, from my point of view, a common legal space. And the application of criminal law in these cases, I think it should be exceptional, because criminal law is not for these cases of design failures. It's basically for intentional damage and for intentional injuries to human beings and damages to property. But it is not the tool, in my view, to solve these cases that are unintentional. And in my country, the resource to criminal law is done because it is thought that it's a quicker way, a quicker judicial way to face the settlement of disputes. But it's not really a very good idea, because what happens at times is that there is a judicial investigation in a plane crash or a plane accident, and after some years of investigating the accident, there is a ruling that says it was unintentional. There's not really extreme recklessness, so we are going to file this criminal case, and the victims have to go to a civil proceeding to settle, to be awarded compensation. So I think we are wrong in using criminal law to give a response to these plane accident or plane crash cases. So I think criminal law should be exceptional only when there really is a clear intention to cause damage, or an extreme, but really an extreme recklessness, such as going to work under the influence of drugs or something like that.
But don't get me wrong, I'm not in favor of criminal law.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to address the question to Judge Rios, but I think I will rather look to the academia. So Professor Spindler, you just came with the questions I had with regard to what you're proposing. When we started together, IFATCA and Eurocontrol, to try to find how we could bridge the gap between the judiciary and the safety world of aviation, in particular air traffic management, we went around and looked, is there somewhere a technical court? So somebody who would reunite the civil issues and the penal issues and state on a technical level. The only thing we found was in Sweden some Havaria court, which was third level court, something like this. And when we started to say, but let's create something like an international court for aviation or so, everybody said, pass on, we are trying that since 1944, Chicago Convention at ICAO, pass on. But this can't be the answer to the system failure, what you mentioned this morning, no? So I'm wondering, do we have somewhere out there new technology, nanotechnology, maybe old issues, sports tribunals, things like this? Do we have examples which we could copy? Like, for example, deep sea exploration. Do we need to go for a new convention when we come to high complex systems, where we say we need to regulate that on a much higher level than what we are currently doing, because otherwise the harm of the destruction potential will be higher than what we're currently achieving. So I'm just mentioning the deep sea exploration because that is one of the most from a regulatory point of view, but also from a legal point of view, the highest level we have found out so far in our research and building up. So less to you, but rather more, is there any hope? So we were told no, but there might be hope to push it further. And if yes, which way do we have to look? ICANN, nanotechnology, deep sea exploration. Do you have any ideas in these things where we could use some sort of a reuniting court?
Thank you. A question to the judges. Supposing you face the following problem. An air accident is caused by a malfunctioning of the EGNOS signal that is already working, or in the future by Galileo. The European Union is the owner of the system, of both systems. According to the space law, a state is responsible for the activities of space infrastructure that has been registered in that state, or have been launched by that state. How would you face this problem? Who is responsible? Where is the liability?
I need a lawyer. Okay. So we have to consider that...
Sorry, whether I said that the European Union is not a state. That is important. The European Union is not a state.
We have to consider that when we talk about responsibility, we have civil responsibility and criminal responsibility. In this case, you are talking about, I suppose, civil responsibility. And civil responsibility can be shared. So we have two strategies, two legal strategies in complex cases. Or we decide that we have to give the responsibility to the entity that has more power, more control on all the system, and so on. Or you can also decide to share the responsibility, and in this sense, you give more chances to the victims and people that receive damages to sue different entities. It is not easy, but so I do not have a reply to your question, because the problem is that the case that Filippo said, when you have integrated systems, and so it is not easy to say, oh, it is all responsibility of this or of this. And in my view, we should consider the possibility to have a shared responsibility in the sense that they are both involved. And as I have the possibility to talk, just a comment about the Carolina proposal, my opinion is that there is no green light or red light on a proposal like this. We have to consider that the legislation and regulation are, it is a multi-layered system. We have technical norms, regulatory norms, legal norms, constitutional norms, and so on, civil norms, criminal norms. So at the technical level and regulatory level, I think that we already have a high level of uniformity and integration. It is, okay. At the civil level, if we want to propose something like a special board or court that can assess the technical responsibility and also distributing the portion of responsibility, we should change also the national civil laws that could be applied. Otherwise, there is a conflict. The criminal responsibility is another story, and I do not think that it is not the case of considering criminal responsibility, in all systems, more or less, we have an intentional disaster as a crime, even though without intention. And I do not think that we can cancel this kind of crime. But if we have a better system of, for civil damages and compensation, also the criminal side of the story could become less important and less crucial. Thank you.
If I can try to give at least a partial answer to Alfredo. I don't know whether you noticed that there was a different perspective between Michael and myself. For safe modern aviation, you need teamwork in the cockpit, in the air traffic control units, but even among organizations. And this has been emphasized by Michael. Unfortunately, as a regulator, I have a nasty job to do. If you can imagine 10 geese here in the middle of the room, they will try to stay together. The regulator has to take a stick and to spread them apart. Each goose has a precise responsibility. This is what we try to do in the implementing rules for aviation safety. Only responsibilities and privileges. Civil and criminal, civil law compensation and criminal law is not our duty, but at least we have to be clear on the responsibilities. In our implementing rules, there are only two possible roles. Either an organization is certified or is contracted by a certified organization. In the latter case, the certified organization, an airline which contracts a ground handler, becomes responsible for the safety of the services for the ground handlers. So inevitably, it attracts on itself some liability. If the organization is certified, then their liability can only be channeled to the oversight authority, because the authority should limit, suspend, or revoke the certificate. In the case of EGNOS, EGNOS is a certified service provider, according to the European legislation, is a legal entity, so it can be brought into the court. Of course, in case of a crash, the first legal entity which will be called into the court by the relatives of the victims is the air operator. But if the air operator and his lawyers can demonstrate that there is a responsibility of EGNOS, EGNOS can be held liable. And if the crash, the catastrophe, happened in the Italian airspace, it is not the responsibility of ENAV if the EGNOS signal was not sure. This is an idea which we have in our mind, but is wrong. In Europe, we have around 40 en route air traffic control providers, and ENAV is one of them, but they have the monopoly only for en route air traffic control. Instead, we have close to 300 air navigation service providers, which provide different services. Mannheim Airport provides directly the control tower. Jepsen provides data for navigation. EGNOS provides a radio navigation signal. And in our implementing rule is clear who is responsible for what. So we try simply to spread the geese apart, including EGNOS.
Are there more questions from the floor at this point? Garfield, did you want to intervene? Or?
On this one topic, or on, I have another topic I wanted to bring up.
All right.
I have a problem with strict liability in the case of collision avoidance systems is the specific example I want to bring up. It's my area of expertise. Take the situation where you have one aircraft that has a collision avoidance system on board and the other aircraft does not. And in this particular case, our collision avoidance systems only work in the vertical. So when both aircraft are at the same level, I can have a situation, they're coming towards each other, maybe head on. My collision avoidance system tells me to descend, and I descend. And normally this would be a perfectly good maneuver. But at the same time, the other aircraft that doesn't have a collision avoidance maneuver goes down. My collision avoidance system is intelligent, so it tells me then to climb. But because the other aircraft also sees that I'm descending at the same time, he decides to do the same thing. At the end of the day, I cannot avoid a collision against a system, another aircraft, that is going to exactly mirror me. It's not possible. It's just not possible to design such a system. Yet, if there is strict liability, I'm the one with the collision avoidance system, and I haven't avoided a collision in an impossible situation. With strict liability, am I going to be liable?
Yes.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the principle is that after they've done their turnings left and right, they end up on a collision path. It's the maneuver that's happening in the vertical that you know, all things can go wrong. Murphy is an optimist.
Is a likely scenario? Are there aircrafts without this collision avoidance system?
There are many aircraft without them, and there's if you look at the risks between two aircraft that both have the collision avoidance system, the risks of collision are really very, very low. But it's perhaps you only solve 90% of the situations between where one aircraft is equipped and the other one isn't equipped. And the collision avoidance system has done absolutely nothing wrong. You know, it's made intelligent choices all the way through. It's been only, you know, statistically, it is only giving a benefit. But of course, probably because you've now changed your altitudes, you could say that without the collision avoidance system, there would not have been the collision, which was actually the case in Überlingen. And yet, you know, the system itself is doing everything right.
Okay, I see there are some interventions from the floor.
Just to, this is wonderful because this kind of meeting between people coming from different areas is wonderful. 2 millennia ago, crazy lawyers, the ancient Roman lawyers, invented this strange thing called faultless liability. Why? Just to distribute the risk among the consociates. Then you have peculiarities. That's not talking about drones. Consider my dog biting you. In Italy, you are strictly responsible. That is, even if you have no personal fault for what your dog did, you pay. In the US, it doesn't work this way because this formula is the first bite is for free. So, in order to understand this crazy thing that lawyers invented 2 millennia ago and more, think about a legal mechanism in order to distribute risk. Then we can work in the details, and that's the reason why, for example, in Italy, responsibility for the behavior of your kids is similar to our responsibility for the animals. In the US, it's not the way, it's completely different. Guess why? Then we can go into the details, but the basic idea is this one.
Can I say something very short?
Yes, we had
Yes,
one intervention before, and then...
Because I wanted to say something about Garfield's intervention.
Okay.
That I think it would be the same if the other aircraft had a different system. It's the same if it's a different system than if it has no system. Because if they have different systems, collision avoidance systems, and one of them works okay and the other one doesn't, why should the one that works okay pay ultimately? And I think the question is, what you are questioning is if it's right to have strict liability. But for instance, the carrier has it, regardless of its having done nothing wrong. And I think in the long run, in the long term, I think it's better for the system to have strict liability because it makes it possible to have a quicker way of allocating liabilities and responsibilities. So I think it's better for the system. And because my view is that we should have a board of experts settling claims, I don't think you can do that with product liability, which is what I think you are proposing. Product liability, I think you need to go to a court to have that settled.
But I feel that, to my sense of justice, this is unjust. There are two aspects to this. First of all, I'll reply on a technical level. When there are two systems, they send communications to each other to make sure that they are not both going in the same direction. So technically, even though the systems might be different, they can coordinate together and get a satisfactory solution. The problem is when you only have one aircraft that is equipped and the other that is not equipped, the other one doesn't know anything about what the collision avoidance system on board the equipped aircraft is doing. The problem I see is that by putting on a collision avoidance system, in this case, you're potentially being doubly penalized. You're having to pay for putting on and maintaining a piece of equipment. And then you're the one who's making the major contribution to making the situation safer. You're reducing the risk by 90%. And yet, when there's a collision, the burden of the costs is going to fall on you. Why isn't the cost going to fall on the guy who hasn't done anything towards trying to solve the situation in the first place?
Garfield, you forgot anyway one thing in your example. You forgot the air traffic control, that they should intervene to avoid
Very briefly, I think Alfredo Roma made an important consideration. I don't know, I'm no expert in TCAS systems, but I don't know if what Uberlingen was the accident, the fact that both were suggested, both were told to go down. I mean, for thousands of years, we have experience from maritime law. When two ships are in collision, it isn't that one flies up and one goes down. One goes starboard, the other one goes starboard, and they both avoid collision. Now, I don't know if this, but if the suggestion of the TCAS system wasn't that both must go down or both must go up, but the general rule, if you have a system or you do not have a system, if you are on a collision route, both move on your right or on your left, on the right, then this probably would avoid your case. But I'm no expert of TCAS, but I just would like to point out that strict liability is not a question of justice. It's a question of efficiency, and all studies of law and economics show that strict liability is efficient because you simply, what you do, you know that you're liable and you turn risk into certainty. And what is the certainty? Premium, the insurance premium. And then you shift down the insurance premium to your clients. This is efficient. I mean, it's so from a microeconomic theory, it is so obvious. It is not so much a problem of justice. The problem is that the victims see it from the victim's point of view. They will receive justice. See it from the enterprise point of view. It will have, it knows it doesn't have uncertainty because its uncertainty, its risk of paying 1 million euros, 10 million euros is simply turned into a certainty. Each year they must pay 100,000 euros of insurance premium. That's close, and that is, so I mean, it's strict liability is something that is, the Romans invented it, as Ugo Pagallo said, and it still works. Ubi emolumentum, ibi onus, and this is in the Napoleon Code when he said strict liability.
We have the last intervention by Amedeo.
Just 1 point, very simple. Strict liability is toward victims. But if I have the system for avoiding collision, and there is also the responsibility of the other aircraft, I can sue the other aircraft for what I have paid to the victims, according to strict liability. So, in legal terms, there are 2 steps. 1 and 2, legal relationship. 1 is toward the victims, and toward victims, you are responsible even without any fault. But it's possible a litigation between the 2 air companies about the responsibility, how to share the responsibility.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to move this debate to the coffee room, but I thank all the speakers for their interventions and the discussion. Thank you.